All right, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers, back again. Another of the OAuth 2.0 authorization framework talks. Still getting through some of this dry stuff. I've done all this stuff here, and now we're going to talk about the access token in this video. So what is the access token? I mean, the access token is the thing that gives you access to what you're trying to get access to. So the access tokens are credentials used to access protected resources. So if we go back to this overview, this generic overview of the protocol flow, and remember I said I didn't like this top part, but this bottom part is pretty accurate for most cases, where the client, whatever is trying to get access to the resource, and that, let's go back to the case of the Google Drive, and say the client is trying to save a file to someone's Google Drive on their behalf. So the client has to get the access token through some method, and it gets this token, and then it can take that token and go to the resource server, which in this case, in my example, would be a Google Drive, and say, hey, Google Drive, I've got this access token. Please give me the access to save a file or to retrieve a file. And then the resource server looks at that access token and makes sure that it's valid, and then it sends the file or allows the file to be overwritten. So the access token is the thing that gets you access, obviously. Now there's also a refresh token, which is a different thing. That allows you to get a new access token. These access tokens are limited in time, so that they can time out, and it forces if it gets hacked or stolen and that access token gets out somewhere, it's only valid for a certain amount of time, and then it's no good. It's the refresh token that the hacker really wants to get, because that's the ultimate power. So moving on, an access token is a string representing an authorization issued to the client, and the string is usually opaque to the client. And opaque means, the client can't see it. It's dark. The client doesn't see what's in there, and the client usually doesn't need to, because the client just needs to pass it around, right? The client here, which could either be a back-end server, or it could be a front Vue.js or React.js. Or maybe Svelte, the new one, some type of client, and that client is just it's getting the token, and then it's just passing it around. The client doesn't really need to know to look inside the token and see if it's valid, because it's going to pass it to the resource server, and the resource server is going to check to see if it's valid. Now you might want to do some pre-checking here, and you could look at the token and say, hey, it's not valid. I'm not even going to bother to pass it. But you should get a response. If you do pass like an expired token, you should get a response from the resource server saying, instead of the protected resource, you'll get an error response saying, the token's invalid. And then you can follow other protocols to get a new token. The tokens represent specific scopes and durations of access. That's what I was talking about, that the duration of access is usually short for a security reason. And the scopes are what you're allowed to access. So in this case, if this is the Google Drive, maybe up here during the authorization step, when the client sent the user to get authorization, the authorization server asked the resource owner up here, and said, hey, do you want to give read-write permission to this client that's trying to do stuff for you? And if you say yes, then the client gets the read-write, and the scope is that the client, when it passes the token and the file, can write to the file, or when it passes the token and requests a file, it can read the file. So there's read, there's write, you can get very granular. You can even say read to this folder or write to this folder. And only read only on another folder, that type of stuff. So that is the scope. What do you want the person to be able to do? The client may only need to read from your Google Drive, so it may only ask for read authorization, and then the authorization server will come to the resource owner, send the resource owner to a page that says, do you want to allow read-only access? And so the resource owner says yes. Then the client gets the token that the client gets only has read access. So when it's submitted to the resource server, say it's Google Drive, if the client tries to use that token with only write access or only read access, and tries to write a file, the resource server will return an error saying, hey, you only have read access, not write access. So that's scopes. Scopes are what you're allowed to do. Duration is how long that token is for. That's granted by the resource owner. So again, in this case, it's not shown very well here. Really, the authorization server reaches out to the resource owner, and that's usually a pop-up window or something in the flow that says, "Hey, we're allowed. Do you want to allow this access?" And it's enforced by the resource server and authorization server. So both these guys, this guy and this guy, work together to make sure that the token is valid and enforced properly. The token may denote an identifier used to retrieve the authorization information. I don't really get this. I've never seen that. I'm not, again, I'm not an expert in this area. I've more seen the self-contained authorization information, and that would be a JSON web token. So that's more something like this, the JSON web token that I've talked about in other videos. That the information, the scopes and everything. This isn't showing a one with scopes. This is just showing a generic token. But the scopes might be in this payload here that says read or write access to certain folders. And again, in this statement here, additional authentication credentials which are beyond the scope of this specification may be required in order for the client to use the token. That's a bit beyond what I've seen as well. Typically, the client is not forced to authenticate to use the token. It's forced to authenticate to switch the code for a token in the code flow. We'll talk about that in another video, but I haven't seen, and again, I'm not an expert, but I haven't seen where the resource server forces the client to authenticate in order to use the access token. So that might be beyond my my knowledge at this point. I'll probably have to come back and fix this video when I do learn a little more. And then a little more, the access token provides an abstraction layer replacing different authorization constructs, username and password. So the token, again, that's the whole point of this thing, right? Is that the token replaces a username and password, and the token can be passed around such that it's used like a username and password, but it's not the user's name and password, so that if it gets lost, it can just be timed out and never used again. And if it does get decrypted somehow, it doesn't have the user's, the username and password of the user in it. That person didn't lose their original credentials to the whole world. So that token is just represents it for a short period of time. And also, again, I talked about in other videos that the tokens can be restrictive, right? The username and password is godlike access to the account, whereas the token might just be restricted to read or write or something like that. So that's, again, the token, this abstraction enables the issuing access tokens to be more restrictive than the authorization grant used to obtain them. So that's saying that the access token might have only write access, whereas if they were using the username and password, if we were passing that around to, say, Google Drive, that's full access. That's everything, because that's the user's username and password. Whereas this token just represents that the credentials were used at one point and the user gave access to a certain area of the the resource server or the thing that it's trying to get, in which case I've been talking about the Google Drive. So, and then the authentication token also removes the resource server's need to understand a wide range of authentication methods. This is so that the resource server, this guy here, doesn't have to understand username and password. It doesn't have to understand random other types of access things. I mean, it's understanding this token. And where the efficiency is really gained is in that you're going to have a bunch of these resource servers, and so if they don't each have to understand username and password or different types of authentication, they can just do their job and only worry about authenticating a token that comes in. So this resource server here might be Google Drive. You might have another resource server down here that this client would talk to that might be Gmail, or Google Calendar might be a third one. And so if you have those 3 different apps, you don't want those 3 different apps to have to maintain code for doing authorization and authentication. You take that, I abstract that out, put it up here, and then you just pass this token around to the different servers. And all the server has to do, the programmer of that server, they only have to implement code that understands a single access token of a specific implementation type. So they're not handling all that other gobbledygook as far as getting permission from the resource owner. All that stuff is taken away from the resource server. And so the resource servers can just focus on what they need to do, which is handling resources. And then finally, access tokens can have different formats, structures, and methods of utilization. So this is saying that we're not tying it down to JSON web tokens, even though that's what I believe most instances use. But that's left up to the implementation or how it's being done by these guys here. So it's left up to the code that's behind these things to decide. And finally, access token attributes and the methods used to access protected resources are beyond the scope of this specification. So the attributes, or what this thing is, I think, saying is that basically, we're saying you need to use a token, but we're not defining what that token is and how you're going to authenticate it and understand that it's valid and whatnot. That stuff is beyond the scope of this. This is just saying to use a token. So this is setting up the greater framework. Ultimately, OpenID, I think, fills in a lot of the gaps, which I plan to get into at another point. Or should I say, I hope to get into at another point. All right, so this is Terry Caliendo. This has been another Dedicated Managers Technology Consulting video. Not my best video. Again, we're getting down into some dirty areas of this spec, past kind of my knowledge. I guess I'm realizing. I understand the high level, and that's what I'm trying to show. And when we start getting into this deeper stuff, I'm not that much of an expert. But coming up, I hope to show. In some videos, we're going to talk about the client types soon. Next, we need to talk about the refresh token and what I know about that. Then we'll get into the client types, and then ultimately, we'll finally get to start talking about in detail the different flows for obtaining an authorization code grant and implicit grant, that type of stuff. That's really the stuff that I better understand. So. Check us out here, Dedicated Managers. This is the channel here. I'm not signed in, so I can't click subscribe or show you a subscribe button apparently. There it is right there. This is the Dedicated Managers main page. Click subscribe there. Hit Dedicated Managers. YouTube.com/Dedicated Managers. This is us here. Click that contact button. Again. I do these videos kind of on the fly. If I do make mistakes, I apologize. Please talk about them in the comments, and we'll figure this stuff out together. Thanks a lot. Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Manager, signing out. Have a great day. Join me in the next video. They'll get better, I promise.